Hey guys, gals, and non binary pals. I'm your host, Hannah, and this is Under the Scrubs. We are back for episode 3 this fine Tuesday. I don't know about anybody else, but January really made me feel every single day. Like it felt like 5 months just in that 1 month. If you are returning, welcome back, friendship. If you're new here, hello and welcome. This is our space to share all new medical happenings, education, history, true crime, and whatever else we can muster up. I do something called a timeout where I get like 15 to 30 seconds just to yap about whatever I want. So if that's not your thing, just go ahead and skip forward a bit. I missed the sourdough train during COVID times. I just got a starter from my lovely coworker. I named it Dobafett, and he was thriving. He looks a little sketch now. I thought he had rabies, not gonna lie. I refuse to give up on him though, because I don't want to admit defeat, and I don't want to have to go back and tell said coworker, "Hey, remember how you told me that this starter is like really strong? It's like 5 years old. It died. Yikes." I would actually lie to her and tell her that somebody broke it and killed my sourdough and then left. So if anybody wants to send me recipes, feel free, or tips on how to keep this thing alive. I actually just found out I might be feeding it incorrectly. So shout out to my coworkers. Today's topic, a fan favorite back in the 1930s to 50s, the lobotomy. This episode, I'm just going to let you know, we're going to talk about mental illnesses. I definitely will be explaining the process of like the lobotomies and just overall disturbing subjects. So please listen with care. If this is something that you don't think you can handle, that's totally a-okay. We'll see you next week and you are still loved. Resources for this episode are PubMed Central, Britannica, JFK Library, PBS documentary The Lobotomist, My Lobotomy, a memoir by Howard Doley, and Healthline. Now, for some reason, this entire time, I honestly thought that like lobotomies were illegal. I just kind of thought that we said, no more, we're not doing this, outlaw, right? Okay, turns out we still do them, but they're a very rare case, and it's like a last treatment for like OCD and like some other mental illnesses, and it's done a little differently, but we're going to talk about that later. We're going to start at the beginning, and who the hell thought that the process of inserting something sharp into the brain to cure mental illness sounded like a good idea. Well, the first guy that kicked that off was António Egas Moniz. Antonio was a Portuguese neurologist. He arrived to the medical field a little later in life at 51 years old. He previously was a politician. He was actually the first person to inject 25% sodium iodide into 3 different patients' brain arteries to create a clear angiogram, or a way to visualize arteries. Although he did try it on 3 previous patients, and it was a different approach, and he killed one of them. His work helped guide angiography studies to actually be able to detect internal carotid artery occlusions, which were typically missed back in the day. So, picture this, 1935. We have 2 Yale psychologists, Carlisle Jacobson and John Fulton. They presented their study at the Second International Congress of Neurology in London. They were describing how they were removing the frontal lobes of the brains from chimpanzees, and that it was causing the chimpanzees to be more willing to complete tasks, more compliant, and they didn't show any frustration. The study paired along with a story from Richard Brickner. He's a neurologist, and he had removed the patient's frontal lobe due to a large meningioma, which is a large non-cancerous tumor on the front lobe of the brain. And the man was left with his intelligence, but he had changed from being a shy and introverted guy to a boastful, vivacious guy post-op. So both of those inspired Moniz's hypothesis on mentally ill patients. Now, his hypothesis was that mentally ill patients had some kind of defect or abnormal connection that was originating in the frontal lobe. So you sever these connections, maybe displace this abnormal tissue, and you can, quote unquote, cure the mentally ill. Almeida Lima, he was a neurosurgeon, or as they called him back in the day, psychosurgeon. He worked with Moniz to create a needle-like instrument with a retractable wire loop to help with this surgery, and they called it a leucotome. The leucotome allowed the wire to cut through the backside of the frontal lobe, and Moniz actually used alcohol at first to destroy the frontal lobe along with this leucotome. The first psychosurgery procedure, called the leucotomy, was performed November 12th, 1935, and was hailed by the Nobel Committee as one of the most important discoveries ever made in psychiatric medicine. Moniz actually goes on in 1936 to perform 20 more leucotomies by taking small corings of the brain out of the patients, but he actually only rid like a third of the patients of their symptoms. So the methods that were used back in the day to try to cure mental illnesses are ones that now we listen to today and cringe because we know better, and we'd like to think that we've evolved. Back then they used to use hydrotherapy. So most doctors use cold water, so they'd like force you to like take baths where you sit in the bath. They put that like essentially cover over it, kind of like zipping you in there, and you got to sit there and either cold water or devil piss hot water, which honestly doesn't sound too bad for me, but that's because I like super hot water showers. So a German doctor, he created this helmet that would give your brain an electric shower. His words, sounds like a bad time. There was a rest cure that involved isolation from family, quiet, diet, and massage, which sign me up for that one. That feels a little like eat, pray, love, and I'm down for that. Another would use a sleep therapy, so you would be induced into a sleep state, like a really deep sleep for 4 to 6 weeks. Patients would be overdosed on insulin, where you're kind of skating that fine line of death in hopes that, like, if you make it back, you'd be fixed. They would induce a medication called metrazole, and it would be given to just honestly induce such violent seizures that patients would actually break arms, legs, hips, vertebrae, and even jaws from like the convulsing. One doctor thought that mental illness came from infected teeth, so a patient would have all of the teeth that were believed to be infected removed. And then when that didn't work or they ran out of teeth, he focused on the tonsils. And then he said, you know what? If you do tonsillectomies on all these children, you're going to remove mental illness, in a single generation. Surprise, surprise, tonsillectomies didn't cure mental illness. And so he started, removing the colon, cervix, and uterus because who thinks those are important? Not a shock to find out he did not cure any patients, and 30% of his patients were actually killed by surgeries. And you'd hear this and you'd think, okay, this guy definitely like got stripped of his privileges, like medical license taken away, maybe slid into the slammer. No, he was the director of the New Jersey State Hospital in Trenton. Now, the crazy thing is like these doctors weren't performing back alley procedures, or they're not down in creepy dungeons that required a password or a secret knock. This was done in the public eye. In broad daylight, Jesus can see them. They're just out here wilding out. Magazines and newspapers wrote articles, even going as far as like applauding these doctors for their success rates, but kind of like, left out the details of like side effects, broken bones, maybe death, who knows. So then how did the leucotomy make its way to America? How did it get its name changed? Walter Jackson Freeman, he enters the medical scene in 1920. Originally, he came from a really prominent medical family. His dad was a ear, nose, throat doctor, and his grandpa was actually a famous surgeon who was the first person to remove a brain tumor from a living patient and was apparently quite the performer in the OR. He'd invite like everybody and their brother to come witness the surgeries he would perform. Now, Freeman initially wasn't interested in medicine. He got a bachelor's degree from Yale, and then in 1920, he had enrolled in University of Pennsylvania and earned a medical degree. He went on to work as an intern in pathology at the Hospital of the University of Pennsylvania. In 1923, he would travel abroad to Europe to study neurology, and when he got back, he took a new position as director of laboratories at St. Elizabeth's Hospital, which was a massive psychiatric institution in Washington, D.C. at the time. His initial impression of seeing all these patients that were in the wards were, disgust, fear, shame for what he was seeing, right? He felt like it was basically a dumping ground for dementia, depression, anxiety, psychosis, just kind of like this like warehouse for these individuals to be dumped in so that society could forget about them and family didn't have to take care of them. Now, I will add that the disgust and all that was because of the treatment and how these poor people were basically being abandoned. But then he went on to add on that these people are ways to be here. Like they could be out working and contributing to the workforce. Maybe just wish good on them and that they could go back and be reunited with their families. I'd maybe start there. Freeman felt like patients' symptoms were being treated, but they weren't looking at the actual root causes. Now, according to Freeman, shock therapy was proving that there was a defect somewhere in the brain, and that's probably where the issue is. He started doing autopsies on deceased patients and looked at their brains to see if he could maybe find like a lesion, malformation, disfigurement, anything that would go on to explain the mental illness so then he could try to find an intervention for it. Unfortunately, he was unsuccessful in this. During this time, it was also noticed that men who were serving in World War II that were sustaining trauma to the front of their head or just accidental trauma, it was making them calmer and like less prone to anxiety or depression. So damage to the frontal lobe didn't kill them, but it seemed to maybe change them for kind of the better. This sounded like it was going somewhere. And so in 1935, Freeman had learned of the frontal lobe ablation study on the chimpanzees, followed by Moniz's discovery with the leucotomy. So in 1936, he actually changed Moniz's technique to fit his own, and then thus the lobotomy is born. Now, Freeman didn't have a license to actually practice surgery, so he teamed up with a neurosurgeon named James Watt. Essentially, Freeman sat behind Watts and he would tell him what to do, but Watts did all of the cutting. In September of that year, the first lobotomy was performed. It was an incision, so think of it as like temple to temple across your head, and then another incision from like the top of your forehead to meet that initial one. So it looks kind of like a weird little T, right? They pull the flatbacks and then they would hand drill into the skull and they would pass an instrument that looked like a thin spatula into the brain and remove tissue. And this was actually remembered by Harry Merlis, he was a former medical student who attended these lobotomies, and he's actually on that documentary. So the first case was a 63-year-old woman named Alice Hammett. She suffered from depression, anxiety, paranoia, hallucinations, and insomnia, now speculated as a mixed bipolar disorder. And post-operatively, she showed her anxiety and restlessness had declined rapidly, along with like the decrease in paranoid features. Freeman's technique was to push past Moniz's boundaries and cut the nerves that connect the frontal lobe to the thalamus. It was believed that the thalamus was the hub for human emotions, so mental illness was a sign of overly strong impulses that were coming from it. But Freeman and Watts were seeing that like 3 to 4 months later, patients were relapsing, so they'd have to perform these procedures again and maybe even a third time. Majority of the medical community was not a fan of what was going on, but at the time, it was a huge no-no for one physician to question or criticize another. Okay, so something had to change if these patients are relapsing, right? They began operating on conscious patients, just doing like a local anesthetic. They were taking cues from reactions and having the patients do mental tasks. So, like count backwards, recite all the presidents, sing a song, recite the Lord's Prayer. Freeman decided that after 12 patients with this kind of lobotomy, that it was a success. But Homeboy maybe moved on a little too soon. He would see these patients for like a few weeks post-op and then just be like, yep, check, success, and move on. In his early period, his stats that he had said were out of his first 623 surgeries, 52% of the patients received good results, 32% received fair results, and 13% received poor results, 3% died. Later, he's actually going to admit that it was 15% of the patients had died. They had issues with like hemorrhaging, leukotomes breaking off on the patient's head, like tools slipping, because Freeman would stop mid-surgery to take photos. Apparently, he was like obsessed with this. He would take, pre-op photos, like photos during the surgery, and then post-operatively. Post-operatively too, he was not realizing that these patients were having to like relearn how to walk. They were incontinent, so they essentially had to be potty trained again. They would lack energy. They had a childlike manner, and they would even have issues with like overeating. But to Freeman, he was cementing his name in history. He took it to a medical conference in Baltimore to report his results, minus, the whole like side effect thing. And then he branded this as the cure for mental illness. Long gone are the days of treating symptoms, because we are curing it, baby. He definitely did not receive the applause that he was thinking he was going to get, because that room erupted with anger. His colleagues were bewildered that he would try such a new, untested procedure like this. Freeman begged for time. He's like, trust me, you guys are all going to see. This is going to be the cure. Lobotomy is going to be a last resort, but like, we're going to fix this. Freeman took to the newspapers and sold his story to the media so that they could paint what he was doing in a better light. Some of the headlines read, Operation on Brain Cure for Insanity, Surgeon's Knife Restores Sanity to Nerve Victims, or Big Advance Seen in Brain Surgery. The story is now going from controversial surgery to Freeman being a hero and snatching madness out of the brain. This was Freeman pushing past the resistance that the medical community had, as now he had public support and fame. In 1941, a man named Joseph Kennedy called Freeman about his daughter, Rosemary Kennedy, as her behavior was different. There was a concern with her acting out and being different that was going to taint the family name and her brother's political careers. This was one of the most famous patients that would actually receive a lobotomy. In September of that year, Rosemary, at the tender age of 23, became Freeman's 66th lobotomy, and those results were subpar. She was severely disabled and lived under almost full-time care for the rest of her life. Rosemary was lobotomized basically for being different than her siblings. As a baby, she was slower to crawl, slower to walk and speak, and she did experience learning difficulties when she was in school. But she was involved with her family activities. She even kept a diary as a teen where she would talk about the people she met, dances and concerts she went to, really typical teenage stuff. In 1938, Rosemary and her family actually went to go live in London. This was before the lobotomy, as her father had become the U.S. ambassador to Britain, and then they returned in 1940. Once they returned, her father was saying that she was becoming increasingly irritable and difficult. She's having fits, and now she's trying to like run away from the family compound. So this behavior led her to being lobotomized and being sent to live at St. Coletta's School for Exceptional Children for the rest of her life, out of the public eye and away from the family. The crazy thing is, her own father didn't tell the family, didn't tell the wife, didn't tell her siblings where Rosemary had gone, what had been done to her, didn't tell her hey, she got a lobotomy that failed. Her dad never even visited her and never told the family for 20 years what had happened. So after those 20 years and the siblings and the mom are told what has happened, they reached out. They're repairing the relationship with Rosemary. Her sister Eunice, she had a really special connection with. Eunice actually goes on to do philanthropy work in Rosemary's honor, and she even founded the Special Olympics. Now, at this time, World War II is ending. Soldiers are coming home in worse mental shape than when they left, and we're not understanding PTSD, shell shock, all of that. So now psychiatric hospitals are being flooded. In 1946, a magazine wrote an expose on 2 state hospitals that had shocked the world with the abhorrent pictures of patients. You've got patients that are laying naked, curled up on the ground, just staring at the wall, just lights are off and nobody's home. Freeman thought that he had this cure for mental illness, but man, it needed to be cheaper, faster, simpler. He needed to create basically a production line for lobotomies. His daughter once jokingly referred to him as the Henry Ford of lobotomies, and man, he loved it. Now, this is where the transorbital or ice pick lobotomy comes into play. The first ice pick lobotomy literally were ice picks that came from his own kitchen drawer, his son Franklin Freeman remembers. The whole thing was 3 to 4 minutes long, so the patients would receive electroconvulsive shocks from a machine that would knock them out. They would place a towel over the mouth and one eye. They're exposing one eye at a time, and so sometimes to show off, he did both. They would peel the eyelids back, insert the pick, and tap it with a hammer. Oh god, this gives me a headache, sorry. Insert the pick and tap it with a hammer to get through to the brain, and they would wiggle it side to side like a windshield wiper, right? And then back and forth like you're taking a shot and putting it back. They returned it to the original position, put a little gauze at the insertion site, and withdrew the pick, placing the gauze right there to catch any blood. The patient got a pair of dark sunglasses to hide the horrendous swelling and black eyes that they would have while recovering. Now, the first person to receive this was 29-year-old housewife Sally Ellen Ionesco. She actually goes by Ellen. She suffered from depression, mania. She did have suicide attempts and eventually violence against her own child, Angeline. Angeline remembers her mom laying in bed for days from depression. She would point at the ceiling and say, "You see those wires? That's what they're torturing me with." When Ellen tried smothering Angeline one day, that was the final straw, and her husband took her in for the lobotomy. Her daughter remembers her mom being drastically better afterwards, and she never mentioned suicide again. She got her mom back. Ellen did require a private nurse for a while, but she actually gradually got better enough to help around the house, take, care of Angeline, and she even became an LPN and took a job as a nanny. In March 1946, Watts discovered Freeman doing the ice pick lobotomy in their shared office. Confused at what he was seeing, but Freeman looks up and goes, "Hey, Jim, can you come here real quick and hold these ice picks so I can take a little photo?" Watts did a little 180 and walked right out of that office, never to return again, and the pair broke up. Freeman said that the ice pick lobotomy was so easy, quote unquote, any damn fool, even a hospital psychiatrist, could learn it in an afternoon. Because that's what you want to hear about a surgeon or a psychiatrist that's going to put something sharp in your eye, go up to your brain, is that they learned it in an afternoon. He had his little motto, lobotomy gets them home, and he had an equipped vehicle, literally he called it the lobotomobile, and he toured the countryside visiting mental institutions to perform ice pick lobotomies and teach resident psychiatrists on how to do them as well. Freeman took after his grandfather with his knack of showmanship and flair. He would perform lobotomies 2 at a time. I'd get tired of doing it right-handed, so he'd switch to left-handed. Sometimes he'd change the mallet out for not one that you'd get at Home Depot, but that's how I'm going to say it, right? Like just like instead of like a surgical hammer, like a regular everyday hammer, right? He would invite colleagues to witness the procedure, and then he would journal about people vomiting or fainting in the office. I can only imagine him laying in bed, kicking his little feet, giggling while writing that. He would do 25 transorbital lobotomies in like one day, and he essentially had these facilities line up their patients outside. Like, let's get it popping. Since so many of these patients were wards of the state or they were dumped at these facilities to be forgotten, they didn't need informed consent. That wasn't a thing at the time. So there was basically this endless supply of patients. So in 1949, Moniz receives the Nobel Prize for his work, and now mainstream medicine is getting on board with the idea of lobotomies. Somehow, though, it's supposed to be a last resort, but by 1950s, Freeman became the Oprah of lobotomies. You're getting one, your neighbor's getting one, your dog's getting one, everybody, okay? There once was a guy who actually had barricaded himself in his room with a hatchet who's threatening to kill his wife. Freeman was the guy's psychiatrist, and so the cops called him to the scene, and Freeman shows up, pounds on the door, and yells, "John, come on out." So the guy does. Police hold him down, and Freeman hits him with a little shock and just does double transorbital lobotomies right there. Another time, there was a man who was supposed to get one, and he got cold feet. The family reached out to Freeman, so he showed up at the hotel to talk to him, and he convinced the patient to let him in the room. Hits him with a little shock to somehow, calm him down. Don't know how that would, but it does. But it knocks him out. And Freeman figures, hey, what the hell? I'm already here. He's unconscious. Boop, boop. Gives him a double transorbital lobotomy. Freeman is starting to get to the point where his patience for standard medical practices is waning. His new surgical assistant, Jonathan Williams, talked about how Freeman would get right to work at times without taking necessary precautions that would actually lead to leukotomes being broken off in the patient's head, which then resulted in Williams having to open the skull up to retrieve 2 to 3 inches of broken steel. Freeman hated wasting time on sterile environments as he, quote-unquote, wasn't worried about all that germ crap. Some estimates that Freeman did 5,000 lobotomies in his career, and people taught by him may have done 40,000 more. Freeman was in Iowa at Cherokee State Hospital, where 3 patients died during their procedures. One of them, the ice pick slipped and killed them while Freeman was taking a photo. He literally just packed up and left for his next demonstration. Now, this crusade he was on was targeting the poorest and most vulnerable population. By 1952, Freeman was in West Virginia on what he called the West Virginia Lobotomy Project. He spent 30 days in the poorest state at the time, and he would operate on 238 patients. His favorite stop was in the town of Lakin, where the hospital, it was named as a product of its time, and I don't really want to repeat it, but it was a home to the hospital for people of color that were deemed mentally ill. That's me making it better. Now, this hospital was going to be forced to close their doors by the state due to poverty and budget issues, but Freeman saw this as an opportunity to save the hospital, fix their patients. Freeman really believed, as the public did, that this was his magical cure, but as a former aide at the Lakin Hospital, Julius McLeod would say about Freeman's magical cure, you're just shooting in the dark. That's all you're doing. Shooting in the dark, and you hope something will come out right. By the mid 1950s, long term clinical studies started appearing in medical journals assessing the true impact of lobotomies. Long term positive results were getting more and more difficult to justify doing the procedure. And so now we're seeing the medical community starting to turn against lobotomies. A former supporter even went as far as saying a lobotomy was no more subtle than a gunshot to the head. 1954, an antipsychotic hits the market called Thorazine, which was considered to be a chemical lobotomy. So overnight, this medication comes out, and now Thorazine's on the rise, lobotomy's on the down. Because, with Thorazine, right, you give this medication, you take this pill, tell me how you feel, they're better. If they're not reacting well to it, you can stop it. Versus lobotomy, damage is irreversible. But Freeman refused to give up on his procedure, so he packed his family up and he moved them out to Los Altos, California, to resurrect his career and focus on two new types of patients: housewives and children. Had your wives, had your kids. Freeman ended up performing 19 lobotomies on children under 18, the youngest being 4. Howard Dully was 12 years old when his stepmom Lou started visiting Freeman and essentially asking for her stepson to be lobotomized. Lou was actually shopping for a psychiatrist to help solidify her story that Howard was impossible to deal with, and she actually struggled because 6 different psychiatrists told her that she was the problem. They all said that Howard's behavior was normal for a boy his age and that Lou could actually use treatment. Howard would go on to write in his memoir, "I don't think my stepmother was shopping for a lobotomy the first time she met Freeman, but she was fed up with me, that was for certain." Howard was actually one of the first patients of Freeman's to go back and request records, as he doesn't remember everything from his childhood due to getting a lobotomy. Now, I'm going to give you the lowdown so I don't have to recite the whole book. Now, Howard was the eldest son. His mom died after giving birth to the third son, and she died from undiagnosed colon cancer. Howard remembers his mom vaguely, but remembers that she had an immense love for him. And, he's going to want to find that in his new stepmom after his dad remarries, but Lou was not having it. She did not like Howard. We would know it now today as Howard having some kind of hyperactivity issue, but back then Lou just thought he was rowdy and uncontrollable. He got blamed for everything. He would take punishment for everything. Even if his brothers were the one breaking the rules, he got in trouble for it. So yeah, naturally kids are going to act out. They want this attention, affection. They want to be loved. They're seeing, his half brother and his stepbrother get it. And so he wants in on that. He's definitely not getting it at home, and he's definitely not getting it from Lou. So she was shopping around for psychiatrists who wrote her off and said she's a problem. So she tried talking to their pediatrician to get them on her side. Essentially, she's trying to get Howard institutionalized. Now, Howard's brother Brian remembers the pediatrician, Dr. Lopes, getting Brian alone and asking about Howard. Brian breaking down crying, saying that there isn't anything wrong with Howard. He doesn't want him to go away. And that was the last time they ever went to that doctor. Lou was seriously shopping for somebody to back her story. So when she was seeing Freeman and she finally started taking Howard to go see him in the hopes of getting the process for a lobotomy started, Freeman actually started finding Howard to be normal the more and more he saw him. So this pissed Lou off. So now she's going to start making up worse stories about him and his behaviors at home. Oh, he's getting worse. And so that was the final nail for Freeman to resort to the lobotomy. Howard remembers being admitted for pre-op testing at the hospital, but the actual procedure, not a damn thing. He remembers waking up the next day with a killer headache and a fever. He remembers, blood being drawn. He was getting shots. Freeman actually did a spinal tap on him to confirm that there was an infection. And so listen to this. Freeman would have the patient sit on a chair backwards, right? So the back of the chair to your chest, bend their head forward and rest their chin on their hands. Freeman would puncture the spinal column with a needle and enter the spinal canal at the base of the skull. So between the actual skull and the first vertebrae. Definitely not how we do it today. We do it in the lower back, and we actually set up a sterile field to do so. But doing it that high up in the spine, you are a small, tiny baby error away from a life-threatening injury. And so this lobotomy didn't fix Howard the way Lou wanted to, so she actually kicked him out of the house and she made him a ward of the state. As a child, Howard was left asking the hard questions. What did he do to deserve this? Can he ever be normal? He suffered his entire life after this. He was institutionalized for years as a kid. He was transferred to a school for children with behavior issues. He's been incarcerated. He actually was eventually unhoused and he was an alcoholic. It took Howard years to get his life together, to become sober, and to get his life on track. He actually got a degree and got a career. He actually also got to ask his dad about Freeman after spending 40 years of not speaking. They sat down at a table. His dad was saying that he was manipulated, plain and simple, that he, didn't really want him to get a lobotomy, but Lou was pretty much up his ass about it. Now, the meeting didn't go as he had planned with his dad. His dad wouldn't take responsibility for allowing the lobotomy to happen, but Howard goes on to say that sitting there talking about the lobotomy with his dad was one of the happiest moments in his life. Now that's sad. Okay, Howard was actually able to get an MRI later in life to see the damage the lobotomy had done. And I will say, with my limited knowledge of trying to interpret MRIs, it's super noticeable. I'm going to try to post a picture of it on my Instagram at Under the Scrubs podcast. But you can see both sides of his brain. Like there's black spots that would indicate no tissue there. In 1967, the final lobotomy was done at Herrick Memorial Hospital in February. The patient unfortunately hemorrhaged on the table and passed, and Freeman was stripped of his practicing rights at the hospital, and so he decided to enter retirement. The last years of his life, Freeman went back to traveling the country to seek out former patients to help him prove that the lobotomy wasn't all that bad. It kind of feels like, I don't know if twisted retribution is the right word, but basically he's seeking out the same people he ruined to try and prove what he did wasn't all that bad. And of course they're not going to come forward and be like, no, you totally effed me up. I'm not going to, vouch for you. I think he was so desperate to prove himself and say, I'm famous, look at what I did, and uphold this prominent medical family name. He lost sight of his original intention. Ego got in the way, and these red flags were ignored. If you are in the middle of a procedure, your patient dies, and you just decide to pack up and leave, and you're like, I gotta go, my mom's calling me, I gotta go to the next place. Sir, you got issues. All right, I'm just gonna say that. All right, so let's fast forward to today. Do we still do lobotomies? Technically, in a way, yes, we do. But they're usually carefully selected patients where all treatment has been exhausted, right? Medication, therapies, counseling, and other regular treatment. Before surgery is brought up, they undergo CTs, MRIs, they get an EEG, so it's a test that records your electrical activity in your brain. Just to ensure that all angles are studied and ruled out prior to essentially going and poking around in the brain. A cingulotomy is the most commonly performed out of all of them, and the medical description is a type of surgery that involves altering tissue in the anterior cingulate region associated with chronic pain. It sounds a lot better than we're just going to go in there and either take tissue out or just kind of muffle it up a little bit. It can treat chronic and severe OCD, treatment-resistant depression, bipolar disorder, heroin addiction, chronic pain unrelieved by other treatments, and severe schizophrenia with aggressive behavior. An anterior capsulotomy follows the hypothesis about the thalamus, and the surgeon alters the part of the brain that carries information from the thalamus and the brainstem to the prefrontal region. It is a potential treatment for severe OCD that does not respond to psychotherapy and medication. The subcaudate tractotomy cuts the connections between the limbic system and the part of the prefrontal lobe called the orbital frontal cortex. It treats mood disorders, suicidal and deluded depression, and frequent mood swings. A limbic leucotomy combines both the subcaudate tractotomy and the cingulotomy, and it's been used since the 70s to treat mood disorders and OCD. The corpus callosotomy involves severing the corpus callosum, which is a bundle of nerves that connect your left and right brain hemispheres. A 2017 research actually showed that this might be an effective treatment for generalized epilepsy for those who have drug-resistant epilepsy. So I'm going to leave you with this. Was Walter Freeman an angel of mercy or a medical monster? Was it science that went off the rails, or was it the man? I have to say, I think for Freeman, the fact that you've got people bringing in their loved ones that are suffering mentally so bad that the idea of putting something sharp in their brain that might fix them, like that's what you're going to resort to, like that's got to be sad. So like I think he started out with a good idea that, I mean, maybe not the whole like, they need to be working thing, but like starting out with like these poor people, like they need to be helped, like we're just treating symptoms. And I mean, we still do that today, right? Eventually I like to talk about the Amen clinics, Dr. Amen, because they actually do like imaging and stuff like that for the brain for like depression. But most of the time it's literally take this pill, tell me how you feel, which it's going to take, maybe like a month or two to kick in, and your libido is going to go down and you're going to feel all these other side effects. But let me know if at least you don't want to kill yourself anymore. I think Freeman had good intentions, and then he just got so desperate, like as he's like, yes, this is what's going to work, as it's it's showing that it's not quite as successful as he wanted to be. He's like trying to shove the square shaped piece of wood into the circle and being like, no, 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 it's gonna fix, just watch, just like hold on, okay, maybe not this one, but like the next one's a star shape, and he's like, no, 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 I'm gonna get this, just watch this. Right? I think science off the rails, man off the rails. I'm a little bit of both, man. So now you guys are all historians on lobotomies because you chose to spend this time with me. You're welcome. Next week, we are going to discuss the popular drug that is sweeping the nation. It's going to become more available this year as it's supposed to drop in price. Ozempic. We're going to talk Ozempic, Zepbound, tirzepatide, GLP-1, semaglutide, whatever hell else this drug is called. We're talking the good, the bad, the ugly, the lawsuits. I'll see you next week.